Okay, I think we'll make a start. So, hello everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in to this latest special Sibylline webinar, answering the question, will the US and Europe militarily and economically decouple in the next 3 years? This special webinar is accompanying our written report, which answers the same question. It's a new scenario piece co-authored by the Europe desk and the North America desk here at Sibylline's Global Intelligence team. So a very warm welcome to what should hopefully be a really interesting discussion. Before we get into the meat and potatoes, just a bit of housekeeping. As always, Sibylline webinars are held under the Chatham House rule, so please do feel free to use any of the information gathered in this webinar, but please do not attribute it to the source. That allows us to have a bit more of an open discussion. Relating to open discussions, please do submit questions. We do have a dedicated Q&A section at the end, which we'd love to answer your most burning questions relating to this most complicated of transatlantic relationships. So my name's Alexander Lord. I'm the lead Europe-Eurasia analyst here at Sibylline. I'll be your host today. Today, I am joined with a panel of fantastic experts who co-authored the report on the scenario piece. So with us, we have Claire Brady, our principal analyst on the North America team, Magdalena Lembowska-Young, our analyst on the Europe team, and Annabelle Walker, our associate analyst on the Europe team. So before we get into the scenarios themselves, I wanted to just set a bit of context really in terms of where we are and really why we wrote this report. So I think, in many ways, it's pretty obvious why we're writing this report. The transatlantic relationship, the bedrock of the Western alliance for decades, is under unprecedented pressure, and politicians, business executives, and society more broadly are beginning to question the long-term reliability of this relationship on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think, that's relatively new. So since Trump's inauguration into his second term, we've obviously seen a marked increase in tensions. We've seen issues such as the war in Ukraine, Greenland in particular, but also, of course, the key underlining issue, which is Europe's defense spending and its essentially burden sharing within the NATO European system. Trump has clearly made it very clear that it is a priority for him and has been for years to encourage or force Europe to take more of an active role in its own defense. And we are seeing a significant pivot in that regard, but there are many unanswered questions and tensions still remaining. Of course, it goes far beyond purely military and defense policy. It goes into economics, and we've seen the tariff issues and the economic trade back and forth be emblematic of that wider those wider tensions. We have had the EU-US trade deal agreed and initiated by the respective parties, but there are still many outstanding issues relating to steel and aluminium, to AI, tech, etc. So there's a lot going on here. Now, in terms of our approach to this scenario piece and the webinar, we really asked the question, will Europe and US decouple in the next 3 years? So the time we're looking at really is the end of the Trump administration's second term in office. That's the sort of the timeline. But what do we mean by decoupling? For the purposes of our report and this webinar, we've defined decoupling as characterized by both sides purposefully drawing down economic, technological, and military interdependencies, including the permanent collapse of existing economic or military agreements, and, I think quite crucially, the lack of new agreed deals. So within this webinar, we'll sort of unpick what we really mean by this, what this could look like. And with that, I think we'll turn the floor over to Annabelle to run us through our most likely scenario. Annabelle.
Thanks, Alex. And yeah, hi, everyone. So in our most likely scenario,
Sorry, is
Y-
that have we lost you, Annabelle? Are you back?
Hello?
Hello, I think we've got you back there,
Can you
Annabelle.
hear me?
Brilliant. Yes. Could
Sorry,
you
okay.
could you
Just
start again, please? Because we lost you just as you were about to launch into your analysis.
absolutely. And yeah, if you have any more connection problems, just shout and I'll turn my camera off and we'll see if that makes any difference. But we should be okay. So going back to the beginning, our most likely scenario is that the scaling back of US military presence in Europe amid ongoing cycles of economic disputes sustains an environment of uncertainty and divestment pressures, but crucially, it falls short of a definitive transatlantic split. This is primarily because of the deep military, economic, and technological interdependencies with which the alliance is built on. And we assess that this, will likely prevent Washington from completely abandoning Europe, despite the Trump administration's increasingly confrontational rhetoric. I mean, a total decoupling from Europe would be a lengthy and highly complicated process with severe economic and security consequences for both the US and European countries. So I'll start with looking at it from a military perspective. Notably, we assess that Trump may likely continue to threaten significant mass or military withdrawals from specific European countries as leverage to secure strategic and economic concessions, including, securing greater access for European companies, increasing European purchases of American energy or defense equipment, or pressure European countries to reduce their reliance on China in sensitive sectors, increasingly as geopolitical competition between those two powers continues to build. An example of this is Germany recently announced that it was agreeing to purchase Tomahawk cruise missiles and ground-based Typhoon launchers from the US to enhance its sovereign long-range capacity. This was several months after the US, the Pentagon, decided to withdraw one of the brigades stationed in Germany and the corresponding air and missile defense systems and long-range strike systems. So we can see Trump's push for European allies to increasingly pay for their security. We also assess that we will likely see Trump using deployments of troops to distinguish between governments that he regards as dependable partners and those he accuses of failing to contribute significantly to the NATO alliance. So in May 2026, for example, Trump reversed the Pentagon's decision to remove 5,000 troops from Poland, citing the election of Polish Conservative President Karol Nawrocki as reason for reinforcing the Polish-American relations. And Nawrocki is one of Trump's primary European allies and kind of aligns with the MAGA base itself. What is important is as of yesterday, we saw the US Department of War launch a formal review of its military presence in Europe, with the specific aim of ensuring that European NATO allies are on track to take primary responsibility for the continent's defence. Hegseth specifically said that some countries will fail and others will pass with flying colours, which indicates that the announcements of troop withdrawals are likely in coming months. And this leaves countries with lower defense spending commitments, most notably Spain, exposed to statements of, troop redeployment or withdrawal. In Spain specifically as well, because they refuse US permission to use the jointly operated military base in Andalusia amid kind of US operations in Iran. And also, they are actively pursuing close ties with China. So, Spain is a real flashpoint we would see in the coming months if we do see future announcement of gradual troop withdrawal from the European continent. Notably, this drawback doesn't constitute, well, we assess it will not constitute a collapse of US European military cooperation. The National Defense Authorization Act reassess will ultimately prevent the number of troops dropping below the mandated 76,000 threshold. And we also assess that we will likely continue to see coordination in critical domains, including joint intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, command and control systems, etc., which means that we get an environment in which the US gradually withdraws forces assigned in Europe over the next 12 to 18 months. But it will mean that the gradual phase will allow European states to rapidly plug capability gaps amid this strategic recalibration. And the phase withdrawal should hopefully allow European allies with limited time to reposition forces along the NATO's eastern flank. And we assess this would likely be led in a kind of so-called coalition of the willing framework, predominantly involving, Germany, France, the Nordic states, Poland, the UK, all of which have expressed willingness to expand force deployments across the Baltic region, as well as I said, on the eastern flank. Looking at it from a more kind of security perspective, we assess that Russia will likely seek to exploit this transitional period by intensifying hybrid operations across NATO's eastern flank to test the alliance cohesion within this recalibrated US military presence. We've already seen several examples of, coordinated UAV incursions in NATO airspace, sabotage operations targeting rail and energy infrastructure. But we notably, should we see an escalation of Russian hybrid operations on the European continent, this could realistically include the use of, unmanned underwater vehicles, UUVs, against, critical subsea cables, or more targeted physical or cybersecurity attacks against military logistics networks. But again, it's really important to emphasize that as a result of kind of deterrence and self-interest from Russia's perspective, we assess that it's highly unlikely that Russia will launch a kind of large-scale kinetic confrontation with NATO in the near to medium term. Though it can be acknowledged that miscommunication or unwanted escalation could sustain the risks of armed conflict. But as we say, we assess that full full scale confrontation between NATO and Russia remains unlikely in the next 12 to 18 months. Moving on quickly to cover it from an economic perspective, again, while mutual dependencies will likely prevent a total recoupling, we assess that periodic escalation over salient issues will continue to strain ties between the US and European states. For example, on Friday, we saw the Trump administration launch a formal investigation into the EU's trade practices after the bloc imposed I think it was an $890 million antitrust fine on Google for violating the Digital Markets Act. Trump has long labeled the DMA and also the Digital Services Act as so-called non-tariff barriers that disproportionately target American big tech firms. So interestingly, this ruling does highlight the Commission's willingness to impose punitive measures on US firms, despite threats from Trump, driving this continual cycle of uncertainty of businesses. It is also important to acknowledge, though, that continued cooperation between the two blocs will require a delicate balancing act from the European states. The US remains the EU's primary strategic partner, particularly as the European Commission continues to seek to strengthen its trade defenses against Chinese imports and industrial overcapacity. And notably, the European Commission's acceptance of the recent 15% tariffs linked to the forced labor investigation, despite considering it unjustified, does highlight how officials are determined to prevent a significant real escalation of trade tensions that ultimately cause the collapse of the EU-US trade deal, which in this scenario we assess is unlikely. Amid this kind of strategic alignment, though, we do think that policy instability and erratic threats from Trump will likely push European countries to continue to intensify efforts to strengthen strategic autonomy, deepening economic partnerships with so-called middle powers, but also accelerating technology sovereignty initiatives. This could realistically include more European countries seeking to replace US-based tech providers, such as Palantir, with domestic alternatives, which could present a salient point of tension in the coming months. Like the DMA and the DSA, the Trump administration characterizes these tech sovereignty initiatives as protectionist and could realistically increase the risk of retaliatory trade measures. And while summits and fresh trade deals and concessions will likely ease tensions at certain intervals, the sustained instability will increase European and US companies' exposure to uncertainty in the next coming 12 to 18 months and further on. With that, I think I will pass back to Alex.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Yep, so fantastic overview of our most likely scenario. Just as a reminder, this webinar does accompany the written report. So if you would like these in more detail in written form and you haven't received it already in your inbox, please do reach out to us, clients@sibylline.com, and we'll make sure to get that across to you. Thank you very much, Annabelle. Okay, moving on from the most likely to the most dangerous. Magdalena, can you work us through this scenario, please?
Yes, absolutely. And good afternoon, everyone. So, our most dangerous scenario combines three reinforcing trends. So, weakening security guarantees, trade tensions, and growing political fragmentation. And as we heard from Annabelle, we do expect some frictions in any of those areas, and none of them on their own can basically break the transatlantic relationship. But if all of them start to worsen at the same time, they can together create a self-reinforcing cycle that can basically fundamentally change the relationship and make it much more difficult to reverse it to what it is now. So even though this is a scenario that we consider to be unlikely, at this point, I'll still try to outline some signals and triggers to follow, which can indicate when we are actually starting to move towards a more dangerous territory or towards decoupling, and what will be the consequences of that. So, starting with security, in our scenario, as the US starts shifting its strategic focus away from Europe towards domestic priorities, competition in the Indo-Pacific, Western Hemisphere, then senior US officials not only that start very publicly questioning the value of defending Europe, but they also very explicitly link security guarantees to economic and political concessions. And even if we might see some variations of these statements in the coming years, the turning point would be when both European allies and adversaries do not longer consider, they don't no longer consider and trust the credibility of US security guarantees to Europe. So this is an important differentiation for this most dangerous scenario. And this doesn't mean that if we see any US military engagement of Europe, it sets us in this scenario as we are already expecting, as we heard, but it's very important how is it going to be done? Is it going to be done very abruptly, or is it going to be done gradually in coordination with European partners where they will be able to fill in the gaps at least to some extent. So this will make the main difference. And even in our most dangerous scenario, we do not see a possibility for NATO collapsing in the next 3 years. The US would be still formally there, but the danger here is that there will be no trust that Article 5 will be honored if it comes to it, which will significantly weaken deterrence. Next, we have a set of political signals and triggers. So, and of course, we do have political disagreements all the time. We do expect to see them in our most likely scenarios, but once disagreements become very personalized, then finding a compromise becomes really, really difficult because the political costs for resolving such an intense personalized conflict between senior US and senior European officials are much higher than. And at the same time, European unity and cohesion are very important in this scenario. So if European states start disagreeing on how to approach the US, some of them pursue their own arrangements. We have new Eurosceptic governments in key states such as France. We are having presidential elections coming up next year. So all of this can intensify internal friction, fragmentation, which then will not only limit the ability for the European countries to present a unified front, but then it will also undermine the ambitions for strategic autonomy and ultimately make it much more difficult to fill in the gaps left from anticipated US disengagement under this scenario. And then the third area, of course, trade and economy. So Annabelle elaborated the different disputes that both blocs have. So digital regulations, procurement rules, different standard automotive, agricultural standards, etc. But if all of them fail, essentially, and then the ultimate trigger would be, I don't know, collapse of the trade agreement, emergence of retaliatory measures targeting specific industries on both sides of the Atlantic, then all of this basically means that we are seeing a lot of declining cooperation, especially in strategic sectors like AI, semiconductors, etc. Lots of uncertainty for businesses, postponement of investment decisions, waiting basically to see whether the relations will improve or not. So this is what makes basically the scenario quite dangerous for us. So if all of these political, security, economic processes start to deteriorate in the same time, so they are basically reinforcing themselves. US decreases in engagement, then Europe tries to reduce dependence on the US, and then the way this is done creates disagreements on policy, on regulatory choices. Then this triggers retaliatory measures, this furthers weakened trust, etc. So it basically just a cycle that is really difficult to break. And the consequences, of course, will be significant, both in a security and in an economic sense. So even if Europe ends up spending much more on defense than it does right now, in this scenario, it will not be able to compensate for reduced US support. And of course, the main risk here is that Russia can exploit the situation. And again, even in the most dangerous scenario, we do not anticipate conventional kinetic Russian attack on Europe, because this is actually something that can reunify the alliance. But we do expect Russian hybrid activities to significantly intensify. So cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, sabotage, assassinations, influence operations, etc. So basically, it's still deliberately staying below the threshold of full-scale war, but all the time testing alliance cohesion and exposing weaknesses, very importantly, and basically undermining trust that collective deterrence is still there. And then economically, businesses will face growing pressure to reorganize supply chains, to increase reshoring, to comply with different regulatory and technology standards in the US and in Europe. Then defense and aerospace industries, of course, will remain very important and will expand due to increased government spending, but production will likely become less efficient because of duplicated industrial capacity on both sides of the Atlantic, different regulatory frameworks, etc. So basically much more complicated. And then traditional industries, particularly in Europe, like automotive, industrial manufacturing, chemicals, etc., on top of existing challenges that they already have, such as high energy prices and other competitiveness issues, then they will face additional pressure from tariffs, from fragmented supply chains, etc. And the impact will vary across countries. So Germany, for example, will be particularly vulnerable because its economy is very much export-oriented. Then just to mention, I don't know, Netherlands or Ireland will be affected by restrictions on technology transfers and multinational investments. We can foresee some potential winners, at least in some sense of the word, to some extent. So France could benefit from increased demand for domestic defense and aerospace industries. Poland as emerging as a major European defense manufacturing and logistic hubs, etc. But overall, the consequences for the economic and trade relationship will be significant. They will require a lot of risk mitigation on the side of the different, especially for large multinational companies that have operations on both continents. So to include under this most dangerous scenario, which I have to repeat that it is unlikely at this point, but if we are going towards such a trajectory, then we will see a very fragmented transatlantic order that is very unlikely to reverse quickly, even if after a couple of years there is political will to do so.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Lots of a wealth of indicators and implications there. I think it's just worth underscoring that even in our most dangerous scenario, the idea of a full military and economic decoupling of Europe and the US is still not really on the cards in the timeframe that we're discussing. The economic and military and technological interdependencies of these two regions are so deep that even if both sides want a divorce as soon as possible, there is so many difficulties in terms of actually how do you do that? That will take time. So this is why we sort of look at you know assessed it in this way. We do have a podcast on this very topic coming up. I think coming out later this week. So we go into a little bit more details about the practicalities of all of this. So if you're interested, please do check that out. But moving on to our realistic alternative scenario, Claire, could you walk us through that, please?
Yes, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to offer up a third scenario that we kind of see as a middle pathway through both our most likely and most dangerous as kind of our second most likely scenario. And this is in which strategic competition between the US and China pushes Washington, D.C. to strengthen its ties with Europe. So, to emphasize, the main driver of this scenario is the US's competition with China. And the bedrock of all of this is the fact that the US has taken a very assertive stance in seeking to reduce vulnerabilities across its supply chains because of this competition with China. And this was recently reaffirmed in the 2026 National Security Strategy, which stated that the US's trading relationship with China is very unbalanced, and Trump has pledged to change this dynamic. So therefore, in the coming years within the US, with bipartisan support, I will add, Trump is only going to continue attempts to bolster energy and manufacturing, advance artificial intelligence innovation, and safeguard critical mineral supply chains, all of which will highly likely escalate tensions with China. And in this scenario specifically, as competition with China intensifies, US China relations become increasingly prone to deterioration and much more unstable, in contrast to the relative stability the countries have right now. And in this landscape, as I said, very much more unstable, Trump increasingly views Europe as a strategic tool that the US can actually leverage in this bipolar competition, if you will. And specifically, Trump keys in on the fact that Europe can offer strategic access to the Arctic, a market in which the US can sell increased levels of arms, energy, and consumer goods, and also at the same time, a competitive arena in which Trump can apply pressure to limit China's access to the European market. So there's a lot of pros to intensifying or close tightening relations with Europe. So this outlook facilitates a closer transatlantic relationship than we currently have. And to develop this strategic and also commercial value in practice, we would likely see Washington, D.C. encouraging European partners to align more closely with the U.S.'s own trade policy, especially areas in which the U.S. deems most critical to national security, will see the most pressure to de-risk and decouple from China in exchange for U.S. investment in turn. The U.S. is also likely to pursue bilateral and multilateral agreements regarding issues like critical mineral extraction in Greenland and just broader EU US mineral partnerships to develop these capabilities. In this scenario, at the same time, European governments are likely to be taking their own steps to protect themselves domestically from Chinese industrial overcapacity. And this alignment helps facilitate a closer relationship with the US. So, for example, we've already seen this recently. Earlier in July, the European Commission announced that the EU is likely to adopt unilateral protection measures against Chinese industrial overcapacity by October. So already those types of steps are being taken. And in this scenario, given that the largest share of EU imports from China covers electronics, batteries, machinery, and raw material processing products, new trade agreements with the US are likely to really hone in on these areas. And again, as I said, in the short term, European firms most reliant on Chinese goods would likely face high pressure to diversify their suppliers and prioritize European firms, but also US firms as well. And what does this kind of scenario mean for European security? In terms of defense, the departments of both state and war of the US maintain their current level of resources in Europe, irrespective of developments in the Middle East, in exchange for this greater US European trade integration. So, as both Magdalena and Annabelle noted, personal relationships between Trump and European leaders do likely remain volatile, especially the leaders of France, Germany, and the UK. This does not facilitate a military withdrawal from the European theater. Instead, the administration just reallocates resources, prioritizing ideologically aligned states, as we noted Poland as a great example. Also, in this scenario, as defense and trade ties between the US and Europe actively deepen, we do assess it is likely that the momentum for massive overhauls to Europe's own rearmament actually slows. So, while European capabilities increase over the coming years because of this new US investment, many European governments consider US security guarantees sufficient enough and make the decision to favor, higher defense budgets less likely in difficult fiscal decisions. Another thing that could bolster this decision is a ceasefire in Ukraine in the next 18 months, kind of reinforces somewhat of a false sense of security in Europe. And that also adds, slows down the pressure to rearm. And beyond additional arms and personnel, better coordination and communication between the US and its European allies regarding intelligence sharing and troop movements also improve, which again kind of bolsters Europe's sense of confidence. But while the defensive capabilities of Europe do improve in this scenario, it's important to note that its reliance on the US has also increased, making some European governments more vulnerable to long-term changes in US foreign and defense policy. And specifically to point out, such as Poland, the Baltic states, and Norway would be those that are particularly vulnerable to frequent or any quick changes in the US's position, which, as we know from the history of Trump, is always possible. But yeah, just to reemphasize, in this scenario, it is kind of a crumbling of US-China relations that triggers actually a closening or tightening of the US and Europe. And with that, I will hand it back to Alex.
Thank you very much, Claire. Really fascinating dynamics there, and sort of brings it into the wider context of the changing world order that we're going through right now, and Europe's in particular attempts to try and find its place between that. Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll move on now to Q&A. So please do, if you've members of the audience, if you do have questions for our experts, please do pop them in the chat function, and we will put them to the relevant analyst. I'll start with Annabelle first. We've got a question come in. Will Europe's tech sovereignty push be the catalyst for further transatlantic crises?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think it's quite nuanced in terms of whilst, the European Union does view, and European individual sovereign states as well, do view tech sovereignty as a, foundational aspect of their overall efforts to kind of gain strategic autonomy within an increasingly geopolitically unstable international landscape. The issue is that, specifically European hyperscaler capabilities are incredibly diminished in comparison to the US. And at present, the EU is currently relies on non-EU countries for 80% of its digital products, including, cloud infrastructure, cloud computing, AI-enabled services, intellectual property, advanced technology. So the gap at the moment facing European countries to, achieve this full tech sovereignty is significant and is unlikely something that's going to realize within the, 3-year time frame in which we're considering in these scenarios. Having said that, we have already seen several European states implement initial efforts to try and reduce reliance on US tech providers. So for example, I think it was in May, we saw the Dutch government block a US based firm from acquiring a Dutch IT company which owns DigiD, which is kind of the main identity platform, which has a lot of sensitive data about the Dutch population. And government ministers specifically outlined risks to public interest as a reason for blocking that acquisition. And similarly, we saw the French Domestic Intelligence Service replace Palantir with its domestically owned and operated Chaps Vision. So these are two examples where we've seen European countries specifically replace US-based firms for public interest and security reasons, which, as you can imagine, it does carry negative connotations, to say the least, towards the US, particularly when Donald Trump is so on it when it comes to European digital and technological regulation being seen as a kind of non-tariff barrier. So we have seen Trump threaten to impose, I think it was like an 1,000% tariff on French wines should they implement further tech restrictions, which does show that, yes, this issue could be a catalyst. However, as we say, there are several other avenues in which US and European tech cooperation is increasingly, for example, through kind of the Pax Silica Alliance and etc. So as I said in the kind of main section, it's going to be a balancing act. We could definitely see tech sovereignty pushes acting as a flashpoint for periodic escalations. But ultimately, we assess that it's unlikely for European countries to push for decoupling to such an extent in the next 3 years that it triggers a complete severing of the US and European interests. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Yeah, really interesting, given the recent EU fine on Google, for example, for not complying with EU law. So it's very much a live issue at the moment. We've had a question here. Whilst the advance in defense and other tech increasingly become reliant on rare earth minerals, and the location of those REMs mostly limited to Southeast Ukraine, Myanmar, China, Greenland, are we going to see more conflict in these areas in the future? So I think that's a really great question, and it does fit into how we the Greenland situation, which we have considered in our report. Perhaps Magdalena, could you have a stab at answering that on conflicts essentially over critical rare earths and minerals?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Rare earth materials, rare earth elements, critical minerals are becoming increasingly important. They had always been, but I would say right now there is a growing awareness that access to those inputs for defense, for technology, for strategic industries can become a real bottleneck. And the problem is not only mining those materials, not only the location, but the biggest risk is that the refining and processing capacity for many of them, it's still with China. And developing this capacity can take decades to mitigate this risk. I think if I can talk about Europe, it's definitely moving towards attempts for diversification of its inputs for strategic industries. So I would say what we are tracking mostly is that we are likely going to see more requirements for companies to diversify inputs in their supply chains, and those that can to do that early, or at least start considering, at least start mapping where are those dependencies, because of course all of these supply chains are very very complex, and these bottlenecks can appear several tiers below what we consider to be the main manufacturer. We are talking about defense or technology or anything like that. So I do think that there are more compliance risks coming, and of course, increased global competition over access to these materials. So what the EU has been doing in the last couple of years is using any new trade partnerships to ensure that it includes an aspect for improving access to these materials. So with countries in South America, in Africa, with Australia, Europe has renewed or updated or concluded trade partnerships that it had been negotiating for decades, and now we can see how this awareness has speed up the process. And of course, it is something that everyone is racing towards. And I do not expect conflict, but I do expect more alignment between Europe and the US for decreasing their joint reliance on Chinese supply chains when it comes to these critical inputs. And this is actually one of those drivers that lead us more away from the dangerous scenarios, away of the decoupling, because this is just strategically so important, and none of them independently can fully secure those supply chains. And even if they do not adopt the same restrictions, the same legislation, the same standards, we will see more alignment in, I don't know, joint investments in strategically important projects in other continents, standards towards stockpiling, etc. And then, of course, this does bring risk because many of these countries have volatile political climate or security issues. So this is definitely something to watch in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Yeah, a really, really important issue, which is impacting almost our analysis in almost every area that we're doing at the moment. We've got another question, which I might pose to you, Claire, if I may. So the Trump administration at the moment is very focused on the questions of how other countries are addressing human rights concerns, possibly as a means of legitimizing the latest tariffs push. Do you see this as a real risk in deteriorating relations between the US and European countries, especially France, or is this likely just another short-term issue that will quickly move beyond?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you've kind of pointed to the reason Trump is currently going after the issue of forced labor so hard, which, to my knowledge, I don't think he's ever talked about really. And that is because in last February, the Supreme Court struck down his main avenue towards imposing tariffs on the world through the EEPA. And now the administration is using a differing number of trade acts to, like you said, legitimize the use of tariffs, all in an attempt to reimpose this tariff regime that got struck down, 6 months ago now, and the US has been giving refunds. So I don't think the issue of forced labor itself is going to be the driver of deteriorating relations, but I think that in itself could be a short-term issue, but what is going to stick around is the use of tariffs itself. So it might not be that forced labor is always the issue, but it's always going to be something, which I think that is the real issue for these European nations, is that they are never going to feel truly comfortable because, okay, if you solve one trade issue, well, there's another around the corner. For example, like these nations, let's say they convince Trump that they're not using forced labor in their supply chains. Well, then, as Annabelle pointed out, they make a move on the digital services side, and then that becomes a new issue. So I think that's kind of the driver here is that Trump is fundamentally views the US's relationship with Europe and the wider world as unbalanced, and he's going to keep trying to readjust the playing field with tariffs. And the reason behind that he says might change. But overall, he's always going to attempt to keep some form of tariffs. We even see this to kind of bring it to North America. He has said, even amidst negotiations for a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, he has said there is going to be some level of tariffs. Like they will not go down to zero. So that's kind of just another example to show that, yeah, the forced labor issue might be short term, but the actual trade implications and what tariffs mean are definitely here to stick around.
Thank you very much, Claire. Great answer. We're unfortunately out of time there. I just want to say thank you very much all for attending, and a big thank you to our panelists for their fantastic analysis. Just as a reminder, if you do want to receive our special report accompanying this webinar, please do reach out to us at info@sibylline.co.uk if you haven't already received it. Well, with that, I wish you all a very good rest of the day, and we will see you in our next webinar. Thank you very much.